Hey guys, it's me, Wolf, back with another Stronghold Crusader build. In the last episode we built a bakery and with that finished our 3 parts bread production series. Now our food sources are definitely covered. I mean, you might get sick of eating cheese and bread all the time, but it's better than only eating cheese. And who cares about peasants when we have access to the royal pantry? No, but if we're talking in-game efficiency, the bread production is the most productive food source, even though it takes a bit of time and also a good amount of wood, but once it runs properly it beats all the other single building food sources. In fact, we are producing so much bread that we might be able to sell some of it to the neighboring castle and create our first gold income. Was that a cheap segue? Yes. So let's just build a market. First of all, let's take a look at it in game. The main building consists of 3 walls, a roof and an awning. We could argue whether or not the part on the front here is a wall or just a hole, but let's just say 3 walls for now. Then we have 2 shelves here on the side, a similar looking one on the back here that we can barely see, and the typical farmer's market display shelf in the front. On the roof are 2 barrels and 2 wooden planks, and there are more details scattered inside the building, but let's come back to those later. What's important to mention is that the market has 2 versions. After placing the market it is still empty, and after some time a wandering trader arrives and then it looks like a market is supposed to look. All the shelves are now filled with a variety of wares, and you can already tell that this build is just like the bakery, very rich in details again. That means lots of things to make, but for now let's start with the basic structure. I decided to use gypsum again, even though I hate that stuff, because I'm making a big mess every time I'm using it. But pouring gypsum into a cast is the simplest way to make walls like these. So I started with cutting some pieces of wood that are 15 x 15 mm thick, 2 different lengths, and made this frame with the 2 side walls, the back wall and the front wall. To make sure the gypsum doesn't stick to the wood, I covered all the pieces in saran wrap and held it together with some paper tape before gluing everything together with a hot glue gun. I used my 90-degree angle to make sure that the frame is relatively square, and to ensure that the gypsum doesn't stick to the bottom, I glued this frame onto a smooth melamine board. Now the frame is ready, and I mentioned in the last video that a painter friend of mine told me that it's important to always put the liquid into the mixing container first and then gradually add the powder. But what does he know? Adding the water into the powder is way easier. Motherfucker! My workshop looked like my bedroom when I was 14. There was gypsum all over my bandsaw, the floor and myself. I thought maybe I can save the rest at least and continue to mix it until it didn't really mix anymore. Overall, I would say great first attempt. I cleaned everything and had a look at the mixing stick again, and I gotta say, who in their right mind pushes this smooth metal bar into a plastic piece and expects it to hold? Okay, it only cost 4 euros, so I guess I can't expect too much of it. I glued it in there with some super glue and also drilled a hole and added a screw with a washer and a nut, and now this part shouldn't come off anymore. This time I also used a bucket and put the water in first, and who would have guessed, it worked way better. I let the walls dry overnight and the thin parts on the saran wrap here came off really easily. The walls themselves were still a little wet, but like that it's easier to shave off the excess gypsum. Then I just started to rip the frame apart, 1 piece at a time, and to be honest I wasn't even mad about this part breaking, because I knew this would happen from the get-go. The other 3 sides were easier to get out and also stay together. Also, this is the mess left behind and I was able to save all the sticks, so I'm counting this as a success. To make the walls look like the in-game building, I had to make quite some modifications. First I flattened them all using a rasp and later a spatula. Then I made the hole in the side wall here for the window. I also realized that the width of the sidewalls is wrong, so I had to cut these strips off. I don't even know how I've managed to do this, but now all the parts have the same height and are ready to be connected. My method here is definitely not the best, but I still attempted it anyways. I marked 3 points on each side and used my drill press to make blind holes. With these high quality dowels that I've made using the turn square stick into round stick method and some super glue, I attached the two side walls to the front wall. Before adding the back side, I still added some longer sticks in between here to act as the rafters for the roof. The front wall took some damage during the process. It broke once here and twice on this side, but now the building seems relatively stable. For the roof I started to lay some thin wooden strips onto the rafters, then glued them in place, and to seal off the gaps I used some narrower wooden strips and glued them in place again. With that done, I was able to pour more gypsum on there, and after letting that dry overnight and cleaning it a little, the building is already looking okay, but I didn't quite like how visible the gaps between the walls are. So I whipped out the same plaster mixture I've used in the granary video. This one has 20 minutes of working time before drying instead of the 5 minutes that gypsum gives me. I once again had to let that dry, and now the gaps are still there, but they're not that noticeable. Okay, now that the basic gypsum structure is done, we can start to assemble some of the wooden parts. For the wooden parts I obviously needed wood, so I started with cutting some strips on my bandsaw, and after those I wanted to cut a few thinner ones, but why was the bandsaw able to cut through the 15mm wood just fine, and now at the 2mm wood the blade broke? This is weird. Now, I might not have centered the blade correctly, but this time it wasn't only my fault, because the blade broke at the seam where it was welded together, so I'm giving the manufacturer part of the blame. But anyways, I changed the blade and finished cutting the wooden strips, and now the bandsaw is also sounding better than before. Let's begin with the farmer's market display shelf. Generally speaking, this is really simple to make because it's just an angled table with 8 compartments, but this angle is what makes it a bit tricky. I started with cutting the angle on the table legs, and by the way, cutting it like this would save material even if it's just this tiny portion, but I always find it hard to cut perfectly straight along this edge, and with this method the wood is also less likely to tear out along this edge. Maybe it works with bigger work pieces or if a woodworker with more skill does it, but that's how I'm doing it. I don't like to measure angles, so I drew the legs onto a sheet of paper to make the connection piece. Because I made this step easier, I have to make the next step harder obviously, by connecting the pieces with an angled open slot mortise and tenon joint. In this case you could also call it an angled bridle joint. The vertical boards on top are easy to make because the angles go across the board. So cut 1, cut 2 and times 6, easy. The horizontal planks are a little more annoying because the angle goes along the board. So I cut off the rough part with the X-Acto blade, sanded the rest and times 6 again, and that's pretty much it. For the tabletop I just cut these 3 wooden boards to size, and to match the wood color in the game, I burnt the wood with my blowtorch. I've been calling this a Bunsen burner in my previous videos, but I think that's actually only the chemistry version of this. After the pieces were burnt, they got a good old scrubbing with the wire brush, and I intended to glue the long boards onto the feet without any support on the sides, but then I changed my mind, and for that I wanted to drill blind holes through the feet. While focusing to drill it in the middle, I obviously forgot that I wanted to make blind holes, so one side has blind holes and the other one doesn't. I connected the feet with these sticks and glued the boards on top. The middle one was still too bendy, so I added 2 more support sticks on the bottom. And now I could have maybe cut the horizontal boards to this size and glue them in between here, but like always I chose the more complicated and fun route of cutting half lap joints for all of them. And here it is all glued together. Next come the two simple shelves on the side of the building. Even though you can't really see it in the game, it seems logical to me that they are supported with 90-degree brackets. I've already made some for the bakery video, but I didn't go into too much detail how I've made them, so I'm describing it a little more this time. The thin sheet metal I used wasn't really straight, so I cut off a thin strip before, and then the 4mm strip I needed. Why did I tell you about the first cut, you ask? I just think it's interesting how the narrow strip curls up differently from the wider strip. But yeah, I cut this strip into 4 shorter strips, made a line at the center and marked 2 more lines 2mm from the edges. Then I used a screwdriver to punch a hole in there. You shouldn't really do that, but I don't have a custom tiny hole puncher. Then I filed off the excess and cut another even narrower metal strip that is going to be the 90-degree connection. This strip can be put through this hole and bent over, and on the other side you have to put it through as well and break it off, that's important, to then start over again. And that's it for the tiny bracket. The rest is really unspectacular. I cut a groove into a wooden slab, then burnt it and glued the brackets on there. Thinking I was done and looking at the in-game building again, I realized that here the shelves look like they're made out of more wooden boards and not a single one. Okay, now looking at the in-game building again, if we zoom in a little on the window we can see this shelf here. I can't tell for sure, but I'm guessing that it goes across the entire back wall, and it's very likely that there's more than just this single shelf. We can't see inside the market like this, and on the animated window down here, this space is also just dark, so I just hopped onto SketchUp and drew some random rectangles to give me at least a rough idea how to build this shelf. I started to measure out the first 4 legs to cut them with my tiny saw, and then another tiny problem arose. As I already said, I drew the shelf in SketchUp, and the measurements were obviously based on the size of the building here, but because of my inaccurate mold and all the shaving and cutting off I've done, the dimensions of the building are no longer the same. That means I had to measure out the lengths again, and here's a little tip on how to measure the distance in a place where a ruler or a tape measure doesn't fit. There already exists a tool to measure something like this, and I don't own one, but everybody can use the Unga Bunga version of that tool. I'm talking about a pinch stick. The real version basically just consists of 2 sticks that can be slid apart and pinched together to then measure the distance or transfer it directly onto the workpiece. To connect the shelf feet to this wooden strip I used 2 similar types of wood joints. These in the middle are called through, mortise and tenon joints, and for the ones on the sides I'm not 100% sure. If we are comparing it to the bridle joint on the shelf feet from before, it is kind of the same connection, but at the same time it doesn't look the same, but yeah. I glued them together like this and used a blowtorch and steel brush to make them look old again. The rest of the shelf is pretty similar, but I had another small idea to make this a little more interesting for myself. I wanted these shelves to be made out of more than one wooden board, so I cut a groove like this into all the vertical boards to later slide the horizontal boards in there. Now the 2 side shelves and the back wall shelf are ready to be mounted onto the basic structure, but right now the building is way too new looking. I just grabbed some rust powder that I got from the chisel sharpening video and rubbed it all over the walls to give them a base ochre tone. But this still seemed a bit off, so I used some simple dry flour soil and gave the building a good old rub. Yeah boy. And like this it looks more in-game accurate, or you could also say inaccurate. No, wait. To countersink the brackets into the sidewall I just removed a little bit of material and glued them in place. Then I glued the back wall shelf in there, and while that was drying, I thought about another detail that isn't really there on the in-game building, but that makes sense to me. For this detail I made these really simple parts, then burned them and scrubbed them, glued these 4 pieces onto a wooden board, and then connected the 2 with the round sticks. And just like that we have a medieval towel holder, or, and that's probably more realistic, a cloth selling hanger. Did somebody say cloth? Yes, I did myself just now, but the awning is still missing. Let's look at the in-game building again. I'm guessing that this pole is able to rotate in this area and is connected to the second pole on the bottom and the cloth part on the top. The game doesn't really seem to care about this movement because when the wandering trader is gone, the market is empty but the awning stays open. To get this rotation I connected the 2 poles with a wooden peg at the bottom, and this seems okay even though this one is a little flimsy. For the cloth part I grabbed a piece of an old white bed sheet, and on one end there is this thick part already. I wanted to make the same thing all around the edges, and I gotta be honest, I had to look up the correct term, and this thick part is apparently called a rolled hem. The difference between a simple hem and a rolled hem is that the simple one is folded once and then stitched, and the rolled hem is folded once, then folded again, and then stitched. I know it doesn't sound complicated, and that's because it isn't.
Sure, buddy.
But it is, however, a little annoying to sew. But luckily I can make it as ugly as I want because that just adds more realism points, right? Also, I thought I was smart by gluing the fabric in place with super glue before sewing it together, but later I had to use a hammer to get the needle through the super glue. So yeah, I was not being smart. But either way, the cloth is finished now, and I also added these tiny levers on both sides to hold the poles in place. To connect the cloth to the thin pole, I first flattened it and then drilled a hole inside to then glue a nail into it. I left the cloth long enough so that I can just fold it over at the right length, and if we're looking at the in-game building, it seems that it is held to the back here with ropes or strands of cloth or something. I just made another rolled hem and attached it on the back of the building again with a nail and some super glue. The only thing that's left to do is sprinkle some rust powder over it to make it look a little dirtier.
Next detail.
On the top of the roof are 2 wooden boards, and I won't show you how I've made them because it was really complicated and I'm keeping that a secret. But there are also 2 barrels, and for those I started with a square piece of wood and used a caliper to make 2 curves. I cut them out on my bandsaw and then cut them again lengthwise into 5mm strips. I marked the grooves for the top and bottom lid of the barrel to then simply make 4 cuts with my tiny saw to pry out the middle section. To make the lids I thought about using my wood lathe, but then I just put a new blade onto a cutter knife and slowly turned this square into a cylinder. Mr. Miyagi! Now I can slide the curved planks onto the lid, but like this the barrel is not going to be round, so I had to taper all of them like this to create the typical barrel shape. And after a bit of sanding, we are left with 2 new looking barrels. We need old looking barrels, so you already know what that means. The detail that's still missing for the barrels are the metal rings, and I used a strip of this thin sheet metal again, then bent it around the barrel and glued it together. This would maybe hold already, but I still drilled 2 holes through both sides and put a tiny old nail through here, cut it off and hammered it round like a rivet. Barrels, barrels, we have 2 barrels. This was the last what am I doing? This was the last of the bigger details, and now it's time for the smaller, more intricate details. Let's start with the 2 shelves on the side here, where we can see 2 small wooden bowls, a medium and a larger wooden bowl, a round glass container, and another glass container that looks like an Erlenmeyer flask. And for this one here it is kind of hard to tell, but I'm guessing that it's just an empty shorter glass container. Just a small side note here, maybe they're supposed to be grey clay bowls, but I wanted to attempt to turn some wooden bowls on the lathe. But why use a lathe when you can have this really unsafe and stupid contraption? This lets me screw the workpiece onto my handheld drill, and it's 10 million times better than the wood lathe. And with that last catch I thought, what the hell am I doing here? On the real lathe I started with bringing the outside to the correct diameter, then changed the position of the tool rest to the front and started to hollow out the inside. Here it's also important to mention a couple of things. This is my first time trying to turn a wooden bowl, and I generally don't have a lot of wood turning experience. This is also the first time I'm using this chuck, and I'm not sure if it works like that because of the poor quality of the machine, but here each tooth has to be adjusted and tightened separately. From what I've seen, you normally have one hole for the chuck key that makes all the teeth expand and contract together, which makes centering the workpiece easy. Here on the other hand, you're never really sure if it is in the center. I also tightened the teeth as much as I could, and the wood still got loose and flew out a couple of times. And because that's not enough already, the cutting tools I'm using are dull and I don't even know how to use them correctly, so yeah, I gotta fix my tools and fix my skills. But anyways, I made a couple of bowls like that and rubbed them in some of my beeswax and linseed oil combo. This wax is not only good for the bowls, it's also good for your skin. Oh, so shiny. Back to the in-game building, and the next part. The part I was procrastinating the most are the glass containers. How can I make glass? I mean, I can't just put sand into an oven. This ain't Minecraft. Or can I? I started to experiment a little bit by crushing a clear glass bottle. To be slightly safe, I put it into an old shoebox and thought I could just hit it with a hammer, but it was surprisingly tough. So I used this glass cutter to weaken it a little bit and I proceeded to crush the shards a little more with a hammer, and later I even went Unga Bunga mode with 2 stones, and I guess you already know that I'm trying to make fine glass powder to then melt it and get it into the shape of these containers. I could have continued to make glass sand with 2 rocks, except while doing that I remembered a video about polishing gemstones that I watched. The woman in the video was using a so-called rock tumbler. It's basically just a container filled with the gems you're trying to polish, other rocks and water, that rotates slowly and is kept like that for a week or so, and then the gems come out polished. So I made a super expensive, ultra premium rock tumbler out of a coffee can and a motor intended for a rotisserie chicken grill. This is so dumb. I dumped the shards in there together with some rocks, closed the lid with duct tape and let it run for 2 hours just to check if it works. When opening the can I got a good whiff of glass dust and it worked okay, I'd say, but before letting this thing run for a whole week I had to test if I can actually melt this powder. And while I'm trying to do that, let's just research some things in the meantime. The melting point of glass lies between 1400 and 1600 degrees Celsius. The blowtorch I'm using has no extra air or oxygen intake, so it only reaches about 1100 degrees Celsius. So that already doesn't work. But that's not the only mistake I made. I was so smart to heat the glass inside of an aluminum pipe, which has a melting point of 660 degrees. It worked a little though, come on. Even though this was a fun experiment for me, I had to scrap this idea and come up with an alternative. I decided to make them out of epoxy resin, and this decision wasn't easy for me because epoxy is my mortal enemy. Not because of the personal experiences I've made, but I'm just happy that the trend on YouTube has settled a little bit. I swear to God, if I'm seeing another person making a colored epoxy resin table, I lose my damn mind. Breathe, inner peace. Back to the two glass containers. First I went to the wood lathe to turn the two shapes I need. These are the templates and now I wanted to make a mold for them. I watched a few more videos on mold making and came across this two-part mold making silicone. Let's just take a look at it. Okay, this one is just white and kinda spilling here. Okay. And the second one is... Huh? Why would you put the white lid on the purple silicone and the purple lid on the white one? This is just... Inner peace. This two-part silicone uses a 1:1 ratio, so I weighed out 50 grams of each and started to knead it together until the color becomes homogeneous. Then the working time of 5 minutes begins, and in this time frame I just put it around the two wooden templates, and I had a little extra, so I wrapped it around two of the wooden bowls just to see if I can make a mold out of them as well. On the next day I cut them open like this so that I have an opening to put the resin into. I'm using this UV resin by the company I don't know, man, CHTAWJ, I don't know how to pronounce that, come on. And I also used a cheap UV flashlight. As I gotta watch my blood pressure. I wasn't sure if this will work, so I tried it out by just pouring a little into this bowl mold and held the flashlight on there for about 3 minutes. And would you look at that, it actually works. I dropped some of it into the first mold to then spread it around with a paintbrush, and with the UV light you can really tell where the resin is. Then I put some more on the spots where it was missing and used the lamp again and continued to do that for 2 more layers. And it isn't perfect, but now we have half a bottle. I also had to patch up some holes on the outside and sand some impurities off, and if you're looking at the flask now it is not really transparent, but that can be fixed by applying another layer on the outside. To make the bottom I simply dropped some resin on a piece of paper, placed the bottle on top of it and then cured it with the UV lamp. And after some time I made these 2 flasks. For the cork on the top I used a wine bottle cork and simply cut it to size, and now the only thing left to do to finish the flasks is to fill them. I thought that the yellow and green liquid could be some type of medicine, and one type of medieval medicine I know is alcohol. That's why I used some Irish whiskey as a yellow liquid, and for the green liquid I could only think of the Japanese lemon liquor, Midori, that looks just like poison. Phew. Now the containers are ready to be displayed on the shelves. As you can see, I made another resin bottle and glued everything on there. I wasn't really sure what these powders are supposed to be, so I simply tried to match the color. The medium bowl has old expired garlic powder in it, and the larger bowl contains the same garlic powder, just mixed with some powdered cloves. As I already mentioned before, these 2 bowls look grey, and I can't really tell what they're made out of and whether or not they are filled with something. I am interpreting the details way too much again, but my explanation for this is either the market is selling empty bowls or they're here to scoop from the larger bowls. Okay, with that done, let's take a look at the in-game building again, and now it's time to talk about all the wares on and around this shelf here. The obvious things here are the cheese wheel, the bag of apples, the bucket and the clay pots over here. So those are out of the way, but for the other details it's rather subjective. This here is just an empty metal dish, and below is a dark wooden bowl filled with flour. The only white and slightly pink vegetable I know is garlic. These green things could be every type of salad, but it mostly reminds me of cabbage. One of these have to be carrots, and I just picked this section because this lighter orange or dark yellow color reminds me more of potatoes. In fact, color wise all of these could be potatoes, but I decided that these are parsnips and these are yams, of which some are cut open. The last section could be filled with onions or shallots, but I just picked another variety of potatoes just to keep it simple. The last greenery is below here in these baskets, and this could be any type of salad again, but I'm thinking that this is hops. Now all the wares are defined, and the only thing I have to do now is to make everything. Let's go over it very quickly. I bought different colored polymer clay and started with the carrots. They are pure orange with some cuts, and for the green part I mixed dark green with the brighter green and some white to get this color. Put a little bit on top and that's a carrot. Next was the potato. I mixed brown with orange and I found this tip in a tutorial I watched. You can scrap off some brown wood color pieces to roll the clay in, and that gives the potato these really natural looking earthy spots. The yam almost looks like a potato, it just has a different shape, and for the cut open version I mixed the orange clay with some white to give it this mustard yellow inside. Then I looked at the in-game colors again and saw that the color of the potato is way too dark, so here's potato version number 2. Next was the garlic, and to get this light pink color I mixed red with some white, and that's way too pink. This much white and this tiny bit of red. It's still too pink. Let's add more white. And it's still too pink. Shaping the garlic was also surprisingly difficult, and it took me a few attempts to get the shape right, because every time I made the groove on this side, the groove on the other side got smooshed together. The best way I found to go about this is to hold it on the stem and use a round needle to make the cloves. After the shape was right, I still used a bit of brown to mix it together at the bottom to create some roots. An apple a day keeps the doctor gay. Huh? I mixed red with some orange to get the same shade of red again, and a little brown on the top to form a stem. For the cabbage I used the light green from the carrots, made a round ball and wrapped it into a thin layer of dark green. Then I just used the X-Acto blade to make some cuts in there, and that's looking good enough. To make the parsnip I took the mustard yellow from the yam and used a bit of white to make the color a little lighter, and just like with the carrot I cut some grooves around it and gave it a little dark green spot on the top. Phew, I made quite a few vegetables. I made so many vegetables that I turned into a I can make that joke. After burning I took them back to the workshop and here they are. I didn't show how I've made this purple potato, and normally to get purple you would mix red and blue, but I didn't buy any blue polymer clay, so I simply mixed brown and red together, and it looked okay at first, but after baking it shifted more to the brown side. So far so good, but we are not even close to be done with all the details. The apples are inside the bag, and I simply sewed together a piece of cloth, and I'm not making that many apples to fill the whole bag, so I'm cheating a little by filling the bottom with this air drying modeling clay. Now the apples are holding. Because I had this clay outside already, I made a few bowls by simply rolling a ball, shoving the back of the X-Acto blade in there and rolling it around a bit more. I made some different shapes and used the brown clay as well, and you've maybe noticed that these two are looking a little different. I just couldn't get the two grey bowls out of my head, and I thought maybe if I burn this air drying clay it might get a different color. But sadly the only thing that got me are some good old toxic fumes. Why did I even make all these bowls? They are here to decorate the shelf on the back wall, and to be honest I didn't want to fill them all with something. I mean the whole shelf could technically not be here, or at least we can't see it. I just made that one up, but at the same time I didn't want to leave it empty. Maybe the trader is just selling lots of pottery items. Speaking about the trader, we can't let him stand on the dirty floor, so we gotta make this tiny rug, and I had no idea how to make it at first. So I just went online and looked how other people were doing it. The easiest method I found was to simply search a picture of a Persian rug online and print it onto a piece of white cloth. I have the simplest €55 printer, and maybe it would work better with a higher quality printer, but I'm not sure about that. On my first attempt I simply taped the cloth onto a piece of paper and it jammed up inside the printer. On the second attempt, that I didn't record, I used a sheet of label printing paper that has a sticky layer on one side. With that one the piece of cloth was nice and flat, and the poor quality of the print actually makes this look a little run down and used, so then I just cut it but left a white strip on the short ends to later peel out the single horizontal strings, and like that we get these nice bristles. On the right side here are the two vases or pots, and they took some time to make but were also relatively easy to make. I could have made them hollow on the inside, but it doesn't really make sense here because unlike the glass containers we can't see what's inside. The only thing I struggled with here were the handles because they came off very easily, but with a bit of water I managed to connect them properly. And with two more corks that I glued into the opening, we have two tiny clay vases. Next to them are the two hops baskets, and I attempted to make them with the same material I've used for the bakery roof. I started to soak the quartered stalks of the Tree of Heavens, aka Ghetto Palm Tree, aka Stinky Tree, that's what we called them as children, into some water and left them in there for 2 hours. Then I scraped off the pith, cut them to length and glued them together like a simple straw Christmas ornament. Then I made some thinner strips and started to weave them in between the star, and it didn't work that well, but after letting them dry the two baskets looked like this. For the hops inside I simply used some green polymer clay and poked around a little bit, and this is looking realistic enough for me. The empty metal dish was quite easy to make. I cut out the round piece of sheet metal and continuously hit it over this 22mm ring spanner, and once I was happy with the shape, I hammered this metal rod into the center to make the indentation in the middle. A little cutting, a little bending, and we're done. Are we done with the details? More! The details never stop! Now you better put your Crocs into 4-wheel drive because we are speedrunning the last couple of details. Looking at the in-game building, there are all these things, and it's hard to tell what they're supposed to be, but here are my thoughts. This is just a wooden box. I cut some sticks, slapped them together into a frame, then connected them on the inside and glued some burnt wooden boards around them. Boom! Easy. This is a bucket. I stole it from the bakery. This is a potato bag, so I used a big potato bag, cut a piece off and sewed it together to get a tiny potato bag. First I thought that this thing in the back here is another bag, so I just sewed together some cloth and filled it with wooden shavings just so that it looks full. This could be a bag filled with wool and some kind of wooden tool, but it also reminded me of the flour bag from the bakery with the wooden scoop inside. So I stole that one from the bakery as well, and I just made a little stool so that the height is correct. There is something on the bottom here, and looking at it, it's probably a small white version of these clay vases, but I didn't look at it correctly, so I just made two simple bowls out of this white air drying clay. To redeem myself a little at least, I looked at this thing here again, and instead of the bag, I made a big clay pot with a lid. It ain't pretty, but we can make it a bit better by adding what I think is a handle, and so I made one out of a stick that I carved round and a piece of wire. I surely dream about all the details tonight, but after putting everything into the right spot, I can finally present to you the finished marketplace, and as always, thanks for watching.